What if the ancients weren't recording their past, but documenting a future they had already seen? Imagine standing in a chamber carved from living rock, walls covered in symbols that seem to depict impossible things, stars arranged in patterns that wouldn't exist for thousands of years, machines that float without wings, faces looking upward, not in prayer, but in recognition. The air inside is cool and still, preserved by stone and shadow, and on these walls, etched with tools that shouldn't have been capable of such precision, are images that challenge every assumption we hold about time, memory, and the direction of human knowledge. There is a tomb in the high desert, far from the reach of modern cities, where the ancients buried something more valuable than gold or kings. They buried evidence. Evidence of visitors. Evidence of moments that hadn't happened yet. Evidence that time, as we understand it, linear, unbroken, flowing only forward, might be just one way of experiencing something far stranger. If you're drawn to the kind of history that refuses to stay buried, to the questions that linger in the margins of accepted archaeology, then perhaps you'll walk this path with us. Leave a trace of your presence here. Subscribe if you feel the pull of mysteries that sleep between stone and starlight. And tell me, in the quiet space below, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Are you alone? Are you watching the same sky the ancients once mapped with impossible accuracy? Because tonight we're going to talk about tombs that were never meant for the dead. We're going to examine chambers designed not as resting places, but as archives. Archives of encounters. Archives of warnings. Archives built by civilizations that understood something we're only beginning to remember. That time is not a river flowing in one direction, but an ocean where waves can move backward, forward, and through dimensions we don't yet have words for. The story begins not with a discovery, but with an impossibility. In 1873, a French archaeologist named Auguste Mariette uncovered a series of burial chambers in Abydos, Egypt. Standard work. Expected results. Pharaohs, pottery, the usual inscriptions praising gods and guaranteeing safe passage to the afterlife. But on one wall, in a temple dedicated to Seti I, were carvings that shouldn't exist. Hieroglyphs depicting objects that looked unsettlingly modern. A helicopter, a submarine, a glider, shapes that resembled advanced aircraft, rendered in stone more than 3,000 years before the Wright brothers took their first flight. The academic response was immediate and dismissive. Palimpsest, they said, overlapping inscriptions. One carving eroded, another placed on top, creating coincidental shapes that only appear modern to our pattern-seeking minds. A trick of erosion and imagination. Case closed. But here's what they didn't explain. Why do these coincidental shapes appear in multiple locations? Why do similar depictions show up in temples separated by hundreds of miles and centuries of time? Why do the surrounding hieroglyphs, intact, clear, untouched by this convenient erosion, speak of skyboats and divine vehicles that carried the gods between earth and the realm of the eternal? And why, when we examine these carvings under modern photographic analysis, do the proportions match known aerodynamic principles? Why do the angles suggest lift, propulsion, engineering? Why do they look less like accidents of erosion and more like technical diagrams? This is not an isolated case. In the ruins of Pumapunku, Bolivia, stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons are cut with precision that rivals modern laser technology. The cuts are so exact, the angles so perfect, that researchers have struggled to explain how they were achieved without advanced tools. But carved into some of these stones are symbols. Not writing exactly, something else. Geometric patterns that repeat across the site, patterns that some researchers believe represent star maps. Not of the sky as it appeared when Pumapunku was built, but as it will appear thousands of years from now. How does a civilization with no written language, no wheel, no draft animals, create astronomical charts depicting constellations that won't align in the sky above Bolivia until the 24th century? In the caves of Tassili and Niger, deep in the Sahara, ancient rock paintings show figures in what appear to be helmets and suits. The local Tuareg people call them the Jabrin, the giants. These paintings are dated to between 10,000 and 15,000 years ago, created by cultures that were supposedly living in Stone Age conditions, hunting with primitive tools, sheltering in caves. Yet these images show beings with rounded heads, antenna-like protrusions, and bodies covered in what looks remarkably like protective gear. Not primitive hunters. Not shamanic visions rendered in ochre and ash. But visitors. Documented visitors. Visitors wearing equipment. And beside these figures, painted with the same ochre, are symbols. Circles within circles. Spirals that move in directions that make modern physicists uncomfortable. Patterns that some researchers claim match diagrams of wormholes, of space-time distortion, of theoretical models for manipulating time itself. The academics call it mythology, ritual art, symbolic representation of spiritual concepts. They say we're seeing technology where there is only metaphor, reading our modern anxieties and hopes into the innocent expressions of ancient peoples who couldn't possibly have known about such things. But what if the ancients knew precisely what they were depicting? What if they were documenting, with the only tools available to them, encounters that actually happened? Encounters with beings who moved through time the way we move through space. What if these weren't tombs at all, but messages? Messages carved in stone because stone survives. Messages hidden in places that would last, that would endure, that would wait thousands of years for an audience capable of understanding them. There's a pattern that emerges when you look closely enough at the mythology of ancient cultures across the world. A pattern that repeats with unsettling consistency. Gods who descend from the sky. Teachers who arrive without warning, bringing knowledge of agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and writing. Beings who promise to return. And when you examine these stories not as separate myths but as a connected narrative, something stranger appears. These visitors aren't just from above. They're from ahead. The Hopi people of North America speak of the Kachinas, spiritual beings who visited their ancestors during previous world ages. But the Hopi don't describe these visitations in vague, mystical terms. They describe specific details. The Kachinas wore masks and strange garments. They taught the people how to plant crops in harmony with celestial cycles. They showed the Hopi how to read the sky, how to predict seasons that wouldn't arrive for generations. And then, most importantly, the Kachinas told the Hopi about future worlds, about ages yet to come, about destructions and rebirths that would unfold across time. The Hopi maintain that we are currently living in the fourth world, and that 3 previous worlds were destroyed when humanity lost its way. But here's what makes their mythology particularly compelling. They claim the Kachinas showed them what these future destructions would look like. Showed them images of the end of the third world, a world destroyed by water, with such vivid detail that when the Hopi first saw photographs of floods, tsunamis, and nuclear explosions in the 20th century, they said, yes, that's what the Kachinas showed us. That's what they warned about. How does an isolated culture, with no contact with modern technology, develop mythology that predicts the visual appearance of atomic bombs? In Aboriginal Australian songlines, we find similar patterns. The songlines are ancient navigational maps, passed down through oral tradition for what geneticists now believe may be more than 40,000 years. These songs describe the landscape in precise detail. Every waterhole, every rock formation, every safe path through thousands of miles of harsh terrain. But embedded within these practical navigational tools are stranger elements. Descriptions of when the sea level was lower, when coastlines extended far beyond their current boundaries, when Tasmania was connected to the mainland. Events that occurred more than 10,000 years ago, preserved in song with geographical accuracy that modern archaeologists have confirmed through bathymetric surveys. But the songlines don't just preserve the past. Some of them describe events that haven't happened yet. Astronomical alignments that won't occur for thousands of years. Changes in the land that Aboriginal elders say are still coming. And when asked how they know these things, the elders speak of the Wandjina sky beings who came down during the Dreamtime and taught the ancestors not just about what was, but about what would be. The Wandjina are depicted in rock art across northwestern Australia. Tall figures with large, round eyes, faces without mouths, bodies surrounded by halos of light, and around them symbols that look uncomfortably like circuitry, like diagrams, like technical specifications for something the artists shouldn't have been able to imagine. In the Sumerian tablets, There are references to the Anunnaki, beings who descended from the sky and taught humanity the arts of civilization. But within these texts, there are also descriptions of objects called ME. Not physical objects exactly, but something more abstract. Tablets of destiny, knowledge crystals, devices that contained information about past and future events that could show the holder what had been and what would be. The goddess Inanna, in her descent to the underworld, is stripped of her me one by one, losing her power as she loses these objects. But what were they? The Sumerians described them as glowing tablets that spoke, that showed images, that contained the sum of all knowledge. When we read these descriptions through a modern lens, they sound less like mythology and more like technology. Advanced data storage, quantum computing, devices capable of accessing information across time. And then there are the calendars. The Mayan long count calendar, which tracks cycles of time spanning thousands of years with astronomical precision. The calendar doesn't just measure time, it maps it. It identifies specific moments when the sky will align in particular ways, when planets will return to positions they last occupied millennia ago, when doorways, energetically speaking, will open and close. The Maya believed time was cyclical, not linear, that history repeated in great wheels, and that those who understood the mathematics of these cycles could predict not just astronomical events but historical ones. The return of gods, the fall of civilizations, the emergence of new worlds from the collapse of old ones. Western science dismissed this as primitive superstition until researchers began checking the calculations. The Mayan calendar predicts eclipses thousands of years in advance with accuracy that rivals modern computer models. It tracks the precession of the equinoxes across a 26,000-year cycle with mathematical precision that shouldn't be possible without telescopes, without computers, without understanding of physics that wasn't discovered until the 20th century. So how did they know? And more unsettling, what else did they know that we've dismissed as mythology? There's a tomb in Palenque, Mexico, discovered in 1952 by archaeologist Alberto Ruz Luwilier. Inside the Temple of Inscriptions, beneath layers of rubble and time, was a burial chamber containing a massive stone sarcophagus. And on the lid of that sarcophagus was an image that has haunted researchers ever since. Figure, reclining, hands on controls, flames emerging from beneath. The figure appears to be operating some kind of device, piloting it, surrounded by intricate machinery and symbols. The official interpretation: a Mayan king descending into the underworld, symbolic representation of death and rebirth, metaphorical journey into the afterlife. But look at it without the lens of accepted archaeology. Look at it as someone from the 20th century, familiar with spacecraft and propulsion systems. The figure looks like an astronaut. The device looks like a rocket. The flames look like exhaust. The position of the body, the hand placements, the surrounding apparatus, all of it suggests operation, control, piloting. If you were an ancient civilization trying to document an encounter with advanced technology, trying to record the image of someone arriving in a craft from another time, how would you carve it into stone? How would you depict something you didn't have words for? Perhaps the most unsettling evidence comes not from what was carved, but from what was known. Knowledge that appeared suddenly, fully formed, without the expected developmental stages. Agriculture that emerged simultaneously in multiple locations around the world approximately 12,000 years ago, all using sophisticated techniques that shouldn't exist in cultures supposedly just learning to farm. Astronomical knowledge that required centuries of observation appearing in the historical record as if downloaded complete. Mathematical systems that encode principles of advanced geometry and physics, used by cultures that officially had no contact with each other. Take the Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a shipwreck off the coast of Greece in 1901. For decades, it sat in museums, corroded and mysterious, dismissed as an anomaly. Then, in 2006, researchers using X-ray tomography finally understood what they were looking at. An ancient Greek astronomical calculator, built around 100 BCE, containing 30 bronze gears arranged in a configuration that allowed it to predict the positions of the sun, moon, and planets years in advance. It calculated eclipses. It tracked the 4-year cycle of the ancient Olympic Games. It accounted for the irregular orbit of the moon, a feature that requires understanding of elliptical motion that wouldn't be rediscovered until Kepler in the 17th century. This was not a primitive device. This was precision engineering, demonstrating knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and mechanical design that surpasses anything else found from that period by more than 1,000 years. The Greeks of 100 BCE weren't supposed to know these things, and yet here is physical evidence, preserved in bronze and calcium, that they did. But here's the deeper question. Where did this knowledge come from? There's no developmental path, no progression of simpler devices leading to this complexity. The Antikythera mechanism appears in the archaeological record fully formed, as if someone simply knew how to build it, as if someone had instructions, as if someone remembered. The same pattern appears in Sumerian mathematics. The Sumerians used a base 60 number system, a sexagesimal system, which seems unnecessarily complicated compared to our base 10 system. Why count in 60s? It makes simple arithmetic more complex, requires memorizing larger multiplication tables, seems deliberately difficult. Except it's not difficult at all if you're tracking astronomical time. 60 is divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. It's mathematically elegant for calculating angles, circles, celestial movements. It's the perfect system for astronomy, for tracking orbits, for measuring the sky. And we still use it. Every time you check a clock, you're using Sumerian mathematics. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These aren't arbitrary choices. They're echoes of a system developed 6,000 years ago by a civilization that wasn't supposed to have advanced astronomical knowledge, that wasn't supposed to understand orbital mechanics, that wasn't supposed to need this level of mathematical precision. Unless they were building something, recording something, calculating something that required that precision. Something involving time, space, and celestial mechanics. In the Library of Alexandria, before it burned, there were said to be texts describing machines that could calculate the future positions of stars, predict astronomical events centuries in advance, and even, according to some fragmentary references preserved in later writings, show images of events that hadn't occurred yet. Mirrors that reflected tomorrow. Devices that looked into time the way we look into space. These references are dismissed as fantasy, mistranslation, or exaggeration by later scribes who didn't understand the original texts. But what if they weren't exaggerating? What if the library contained technical manuals, operating instructions, documentation of technology that seemed like magic because it was so far beyond the understanding of those who found it? There's a reason conquerors throughout history have burned libraries. Knowledge is dangerous. But what if the most dangerous knowledge wasn't about weapons or politics? What if it was about time itself? About how to move through it? About how to send messages backward or forward, across centuries, across the great gulf that separates one age from another? The indigenous people of the Amazon speak of a time when the sky was different, when Grandfather Sun walked among the people and taught them the secrets of the forest. But he also taught them about machines, about cities that floated in the air, about visitors who could step out of one moment and into another. And he told them these visitors would return, that they had come from a place called tomorrow, and they would keep coming, keep checking, keep watching to see if humanity remembered the lessons. In the highlands of Peru, there are stone structures called Inca seats, carved rock formations positioned to align with specific astronomical events. But here's what's strange. Some of these alignments don't match the current sky. They match astronomical configurations from thousands of years in the past, or, in some cases, thousands of years in the future. It's as if whoever carved these observation points knew what the sky looked like at different points in time. Not through calculation alone, but through observation. As if they had seen it. As if they had been there. Time capsules are a modern concept. We fill them with newspapers and photographs and cultural artifacts. Bury them or seal them in cornerstones. Leave messages for the future. But what if the ancients were doing the same thing in reverse? What if they were creating time capsules designed to send information backward? Messages buried in stone, encrypted in myth, hidden in astronomical alignments, waiting for the moment when humanity would be technologically advanced enough to decode them? And perhaps, most unsettling of all, what if some of those messages are warnings? If you spend long enough examining these sites, walking through these tombs, studying these impossible carvings and anachronistic knowledge systems, a pattern emerges. These aren't celebrations. These aren't monuments to achievement. These are archives of anxiety, warnings about cycles, about what happens when civilizations reach certain technological thresholds, about what comes next. What if the time travelers they encountered weren't exploring the past for academic interest, but checking on crucial moments, documenting decision points, trying to understand where things went wrong or right, trying to map the branching paths of human history to understand which choices lead to survival and which lead to extinction? If you knew the future, if you had seen what becomes of us, would you try to warn the past? And if you tried, how would you encode that warning in a way that would survive millennia? How would you ensure that when humanity finally developed the tools to understand your message, they would know it wasn't mythology but memory? The tombs themselves follow patterns that make no sense if they're simply burial chambers. They're oriented to stellar alignments that repeat on cycles of thousands of years. They're constructed with acoustic properties that amplify certain frequencies while dampening others, creating soundscapes that modern researchers have discovered can alter brain states, induce meditative conditions, even affect perception of time. They contain chambers within chambers, hidden passages that lead to smaller rooms covered in symbols that seem to function as some kind of database, cataloging systems organizing information we can't yet fully interpret. The Great Pyramid of Giza is the most famous example, but it's far from alone. Across the world, these massive stone structures share commonalities that orthodox archaeology struggles to explain. They're built with astronomical precision. They incorporate mathematical constants like pi and phi in their dimensions. They're positioned at locations that form geometric patterns when mapped globally, patterns that only become visible when viewed from above, from an altitude that ancient civilizations supposedly could never achieve. And inside many of them, in the deepest chambers, are inscriptions that don't match the culture that supposedly built them. Symbols that appear elsewhere in the world, in locations separated by oceans and centuries. As if someone was using the same alphabet, the same notation system, leaving messages in multiple locations to increase the chance that at least one would survive, would be found, would be understood. In the tomb of Dendera, Egypt, there are ceiling paintings showing zodiac constellations, but with a twist. The constellations are shown in positions they occupied thousands of years before the temple was built. Why would Egyptian priests depict an ancient sky they never saw? The conventional answer is that they were calculating backward, using astronomical knowledge to recreate historical celestial positions. But that explanation requires sophisticated understanding of precession, of stellar motion, of mathematics that wasn't supposed to exist in dynastic Egypt. Or there's another explanation. They were recording what they had been shown, what someone had shown them, images of the sky at different points in history, provided by visitors who could move between those points. Documentation of when these visitors arrived, marked by the position of stars, creating a timeline that spans millennia. The Nazca lines in Peru present a similar mystery. Massive geoglyphs carved into the desert floor, depicting animals, geometric shapes, and symbols that only make sense when viewed from above. Some of these lines stretch for miles, perfectly straight across varied terrain, maintaining precision that would be difficult even with modern surveying equipment. The official explanation: ritual pathways, religious symbols meant for the gods to see from the heavens. But what if the gods weren't looking down? What if they were arriving and these were markers, landing guides, astronomical coordinates carved into the earth itself, visible from altitude, designed to remain legible for thousands of years because desert preserves what forest and field destroy? What if these weren't messages to the sky, but messages from the sky, showing humanity where and when certain events would occur, certain arrivals would happen, certain doorways through time would open? There are smaller details too, scattered through dozens of sites, that suggest coordination across cultures that supposedly never met. A specific symbol, a circle with a cross through it, quartered, appears in Mesopotamian cylinder seals, Mayan glyphs, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and Celtic stone carvings. It's explained away as independent invention, a simple symbol representing common concepts like the four directions or the division of earth and sky. But when you examine the contexts in which it appears, it's almost always associated with similar ideas. Time, cycles, return, eternal repetition. What if it wasn't multiple cultures independently creating the same symbol? What if it was one source, one group of teachers or visitors, leaving the same mark across time and space? A signature, a calling card, a symbol that meant, we were here, we are here, we will be here. In the ancient Egyptian concept of time, there were two words, Nihe and Jet. Nihe represented cyclical time, the endless repetition of days and seasons, the circular nature of existence. Jet represented linear time, the progression from creation toward an eventual end. But there was a third concept, less frequently discussed, called He. Infinite time, time without direction. Time as a dimension that could be navigated rather than simply experienced. Modern physics is only now beginning to approach similar ideas. Time as a dimension like space. The possibility of closed time-like curves. The theoretical framework for traversing time under certain conditions involving massive gravitational fields or wormholes. We treat these as cutting-edge concepts, revolutionary ideas emerging from Einstein's relativity and quantum mechanics. But the Egyptians were discussing navigable time thousands of years ago. How? Were they speculating philosophically, creating metaphysical concepts that coincidentally align with modern physics? Or were they describing something they had been taught, something they had witnessed? The Dogon people of Mali have astronomical knowledge they shouldn't possess. They describe Sirius as a binary star system, with Sirius B orbiting the brighter Sirius A. They detail the orbital period, approximately 50 years, with remarkable accuracy. They describe Sirius B as extremely dense, made of matter heavier than anything on Earth. All of this is correct. Sirius is indeed a binary system, and Sirius B is a white dwarf, incredibly dense, taking about 50 years to complete its orbit. But Sirius B is invisible to the naked eye. It wasn't discovered by Western astronomy until 1862, and its extreme density wasn't confirmed until the 20th century. So how did the Dogon know? Their answer is unambiguous. They were told by the Namo, amphibious beings who visited Earth from the Sirius system and taught them about the stars. Beings who arrived in vessels that descended from the sky with great noise and fire, who lived in water but breathed air, who promised to return. Western anthropologists have struggled to explain this. Some suggest the Dogon learned about Sirius from visiting Europeans in the early 20th century and incorporated it into their existing mythology. But the Dogon traditions referencing the Namo and Sirius B date back centuries, documented in their oral traditions and ritual practices long before any European could have told them. And the Dogon don't just know about Sirius. They know about Jupiter's moons, Saturn's rings, details about the solar system that require telescopic observation. Gentle reader, wandering with us through these impossible histories, if this speaks to something you've sensed but couldn't name, then perhaps let the algorithm know you're here. A simple gesture, a subscription, a signal that you're drawn to the places where mythology and physics embrace. And whisper in the comments. What's the strangest ancient knowledge you've encountered? What made you pause and wonder if the ancients knew more than we credit them with? There's a temple complex in Cambodia called Angkor Wat, built in the 12th century and nominally dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu. It's massive, the largest religious structure ever built, and its architecture encodes astronomical alignments with stunning precision. But there's something else encoded in its dimensions. The central tower represents Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain at the center of the universe in Hindu and Buddhist cosmology. But when researchers measured the temple's distances and proportions, they found it functions as a scale model of cosmic time. The distances between certain architectural features correspond to lengths of astronomical ages, the precession of the equinoxes, the cycles of planetary conjunctions. It's as if the temple itself is a three-dimensional calendar, mapping time across millennia. Walk from one gate to another, and you've traversed ages. Circle the complex, and you've moved through cycles that span epochs. The temple doesn't just sit in time. It represents time, maps it, makes it tangible and walkable. But here's what disturbs archaeologists who've studied it carefully. Some of the astronomical alignments encoded in Angkor Wat's structure correspond to celestial configurations that won't occur until the future. Not the distant future, but our near future. Alignments happening in the 21st and 22nd centuries. As if whoever designed this temple wasn't just honoring the gods of their past, but marking events they knew were coming. Documenting a timeline that stretched beyond their era into ours. Why would 12th century builders care about astronomical events 1,000 years away? Why encode that information in stone, in measurements, in the permanent architecture of their most sacred site? Unless the information came from someone who understood the importance of those future moments. Someone who knew what was coming. Someone who had seen it. In the pyramid texts of ancient Egypt, some of the oldest religious writings in human history, there are passages that describe the pharaoh's journey after death. He ascends to the sky, transforms into a star, joins the circumpolar stars that never set, that circle eternally around the celestial pole. Standard afterlife mythology, scholars say. Symbolic representation of eternal life among the gods. But read the texts more carefully, and they're describing something more specific. They detail a journey through gates, a progression through multiple stages, each requiring knowledge of specific words, specific passwords, specific technologies. They use that word, or the closest Egyptian equivalent, Heka, which translates as both magic and technology. As if to the ancients there was no distinction. The pharaoh is told he will travel in the boat of millions of years. He will see the future unfolded before him. He will visit the house of the horizon, where past and future exist simultaneously. These aren't metaphors, they're instructions. They're describing a process, a method, a technology for moving through time. And they're telling the pharaoh he will return, that he will come back, that death is not an end but a doorway into a larger navigation through the dimensions of time. What if the tombs weren't about preserving the dead, but about preparing them for this journey? What if the elaborate burial processes, the mummification, the grave goods, the inscribed spells, were all meant to ensure the deceased could function as some kind of traveler? What if these weren't hopes for a metaphorical afterlife, but technical preparations for an actual journey through time? Consider the items buried with the pharaohs. Models of boats, detailed maps, texts containing astronomical calculations. Food, but also symbols of sustenance that don't decay. Gold bread, symbolic provisions that seem absurdly impractical for an afterlife but perfectly logical if they represent something else. Coordinates, data, information encoded in physical objects designed to survive, to be carried, to serve as reference guides for someone moving through unfamiliar temporal territory. The ancient Chinese had a similar concept. The Han Dynasty tombs contained jade suits, entire body coverings made of jade pieces sewn together with gold thread. The official explanation is that jade was believed to preserve the body, prevent decay, ensure immortality. But jade has another property. It's piezoelectric. Under pressure, it generates electrical charges. A body encased in jade, in a hermetically sealed tomb, insulated by stone, creates a unique electromagnetic environment. Modern researchers have measured unusual electromagnetic fields around some of these tombs, fluctuations that don't correspond to natural geological sources. What if the jade suits weren't about preservation but about protection? Shielding, creating a stable electromagnetic field around the body during some kind of transition or transport that required protection from temporal radiation or quantum instability. What if these cultures understood that moving through time required not just knowledge but specific physical preparation, specific protection, specific technologies that we're only now beginning to understand? There are accounts, scattered through historical texts and dismissed as legend, of people disappearing from tombs, bodies that vanished, sarcophagi opened to reveal not remains but emptiness, always explained as grave robbery, desecration, theft. But sometimes the tombs were found sealed, undisturbed, the protective spells intact, and yet the body was gone. Taken, the texts sometimes say, called back, summoned to the horizon. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there are descriptions of the bardo, the intermediate state between death and rebirth. But the bardo isn't described in vague spiritual terms. It's described with geometric precision. The soul travels through multiple stages, each with specific characteristics. There are measurements of time, though time functions differently there. There are descriptions of lights, sounds, visions that must be interpreted correctly. And there are warnings about choosing the wrong path, the wrong exit, the wrong moment of return, which could result in being born into the wrong time, the wrong place, the wrong cycle. The Tibetan lamas who preserved these texts describe them as navigation manuals. Instructions for consciousness moving through dimensions where physical laws don't apply in expected ways. Where time becomes negotiable, where cause and effect can loop and branch, where the careful traveler can find pathways to moments and places far from their point of origin. Western psychology dismisses these as sophisticated systems of hallucination management, cultural frameworks for processing the dying brain's final experiences. But what if the dying brain isn't hallucinating? What if it's beginning to perceive dimensions normally filtered out by the constraints of physical existence? What if death isn't an end but a doorway, and these texts are genuinely describing what lies beyond, not metaphorically but literally? The tombs built by these cultures weren't symbols. They were facilities, designed, constructed, positioned according to principles that ensured certain conditions, electromagnetic, acoustic, astronomical, would be present. They were launch sites, stations, doorways, built by civilizations who understood that time could be navigated, and who left these structures as access points, as markers, as archives for those who would come after or before, or from another branch of possibility altogether. In the Americas, there's a persistent legend about a place called Paititi, the lost city of the Inca. Spanish conquistadors heard stories about a city of gold hidden in the jungle, protected by mists and magic, where the last Inca retreated when their empire fell. Expeditions have searched for centuries. Nothing definitive has been found. But here's what's interesting. The Inca descriptions of Paititi don't emphasize gold. They emphasize knowledge. They describe it as a place where the ancestors' wisdom was preserved, where the secrets of time and the sky were kept safe, where the children of tomorrow would one day come to learn. The Inca had a concept called Pakakuti, the overturning of space-time. They believed history moved in cycles, that every 500 years approximately, the world would transform, would end and begin again simultaneously. But they didn't see these transformations as disasters to fear. They saw them as doorways, moments when the barriers between different times became thin, when those with knowledge could step through, could move from one age to another. Some Inca legends speak of amautas, wise teachers who could walk between worlds, who appeared in one era, then vanished, then reappeared generations later unchanged, who taught that time was not a prison but a landscape, and those who understood the paths could travel it. These amautas supposedly built hidden temples, observatories that marked specific moments when the doorways would open. And they said that during Pakakuti, during these great overturnings, travelers from future worlds would come back to crucial moments, trying to influence outcomes, trying to guide humanity toward survival rather than collapse. What if Paititi wasn't a city of physical gold, but a repository of temporal knowledge? A library of understanding about how time works, how to move through it, how to recognize the moments when travel is possible. What if the Inca hid it not from Spanish conquistadors but from an earlier disaster, preserving knowledge that predated them, knowledge passed down from whoever taught them their astronomical calendar, their surgical techniques, their engineering that allowed them to build cities in locations that modern architects say shouldn't be possible? In the Celtic traditions of Ireland and Britain, there are stories about Tir na Nog, the land of the young, where time moves differently. The legends describe people who traveled there, spent what felt like a day, and returned to find centuries had passed. Or, conversely, people who aged decades in what the outside world experienced as moments. The descriptions are remarkably consistent. These weren't metaphors for death or spirit realms, but actual places, actual locations where the relationship between inner experience and outer time became unstable. And these places had markers, standing stones, cairns, circles of rock positioned according to astronomical alignments. The megaliths scattered across Ireland, Scotland, England, Stonehenge being the most famous, are traditionally explained as ritual sites, ceremonial centers, perhaps astronomical observatories. But what if they were something more functional? What if they were technology? Stone configurations creating specific conditions, electromagnetic, gravitational, quantum, that made these locations points where time could be accessed differently? Modern researchers have detected unusual phenomena at these sites. Ultrasound emissions from some standing stones at frequencies that affect human consciousness. Magnetic anomalies that don't correspond to geological explanations. Electronic equipment malfunctioning in specific patterns. Local legends warning about strange disappearances. Time distortions. People who walked into the circles and emerged disoriented, claiming hours had passed when only minutes had, or vice versa. These aren't ghost stories. These are documented, repeated experiences that happen often enough that local authorities sometimes put up warning signs about the dangers of lingering at these sites during certain times of year, particularly during astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, planetary alignments, when whatever effect these stones create becomes amplified. If you're following this thread deeper into places where ancient architecture and modern physics intersect, where stone and starlight conspire to challenge linear time, then be part of this continuing exploration. Subscribe to ensure you don't miss where this journey leads next. And share in the space below. Have you ever experienced time strangely? A moment that felt dilated, compressed, or somehow outside normal flow? You're not alone. The ancient Persians had Zoroastrian texts describing Frashokharidi, the final renovation of the universe. But unlike linear eschatologies that see history moving toward a single endpoint, Frashokharidi described time as eventually folding back on itself. The end meeting the beginning. All moments in history becoming accessible simultaneously. And during this final renovation, all the righteous dead would return, would be restored, would step out of their tombs not into an abstract heaven but back into the physical world, into all times at once. What if this wasn't religious hope but scientific knowledge? A description of what happens at certain cosmic moments, certain astronomical configurations when the structure of spacetime itself becomes malleable. What if the righteous dead, who would return, were simply those who had prepared correctly, who possessed the knowledge of how to navigate time, who had left themselves markers and methods for making the journey? The tombs, in this interpretation, become waiting rooms, archives containing the necessary information for consciousness to survive the transition, to navigate the periods between physical incarnations, to find the right doors at the right moments and step through into other times. They're built at locations chosen for specific properties: magnetic fields, crystal deposits, underground water channels, stone compositions, that create the conditions necessary for these transitions. In quantum physics, there's a concept called retrocausality, the idea that effects can precede causes, that information can flow backward through time under certain conditions. It's mathematically viable but profoundly counterintuitive. Yet several experiments have demonstrated quantum entanglement across time, where measurements made in the present appear to influence outcomes in the past. The universe, at the quantum level, doesn't respect the arrow of time we experience at the macro scale. What if ancient civilizations understood this intuitively or through observation? What if they built these massive stone structures not despite their primitive tools but using knowledge that transcended the apparent limitations of their era? Knowledge that came from encountering travelers, teachers, visitors who moved through time the way we move through space, who left instructions encoded in monument and myth because they knew these instructions would be needed. The tombs weren't graves. They were terminals, transit stations, libraries, training centers, places where the boundaries between past, present, and future became thin enough to cross, where those with eyes to see could read the messages left in stone and sky, where humanity's potential future could reach back to crucial moments in its past, trying to ensure the right choices were made, the right paths taken, the right knowledge preserved. There's a place in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, and it shouldn't exist. Discovered in 1994, it predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years, predates the pyramids by 7,000 years. It was built around 9,500 BCE by people who were supposedly hunter-gatherers. No agriculture, no cities, no complex social structures capable of organizing the labor required to quarry, transport, and erect stones weighing up to 16 tons. And yet there it stands. Massive carved pillars arranged in circles, covered with reliefs of animals, abstract symbols, and figures that some researchers believe represent humanoid beings wearing elaborate garments or equipment. The academic consensus is that Göbekli Tepe proves we've underestimated prehistoric humans, that complex ritual behavior and monumental architecture preceded agriculture rather than following it. But that explanation creates more questions than it answers. Why build this? Why invest thousands of hours of labor into carving these pillars with such precision, such artistry, such clear intentionality, if you're a nomadic group struggling to survive? Unless you weren't struggling. Unless you weren't nomadic in the way we imagine. Unless you were remembering something or someone had taught you something, or you were following instructions left by others who came before. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe include symbols that appear to be astronomical. Representations of constellations, though not necessarily as they appeared in the sky at the time of construction. Some researchers believe the site is a star map, documenting the sky during a specific period, but not 9,500 BCE. The alignment corresponds better to approximately 10,800 BCE, more than 1,000 years earlier. Why would builders memorialize a sky they never saw? Unless they were documenting something they had been told about, an important moment, an event, an arrival, and there's evidence the site was deliberately buried. Not abandoned and slowly covered by time, but intentionally filled in with debris. Someone went to enormous effort to preserve it under earth and stone, protecting it, hiding it, ensuring it would survive whatever was coming next, to be discovered by whoever came after, in a future age when the message it contained would be needed or understood. Göbekli Tepe sits in a region that ancient texts called the cradle of civilization, the Fertile Crescent where agriculture supposedly began, where the first cities rose, where writing was invented. But what if it wasn't the first? What if Göbekli Tepe, and sites like it that we're only beginning to discover, are evidence of something that came before? A global civilization, or at least a connected network of knowledge, that existed before the Younger Dryas impact event, before the catastrophic climate changes at the end of the last ice age, before the floods and upheavals that destroyed most evidence of what came before. There are dozens of flood myths from cultures around the world. The biblical flood, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Deucalion in Greek mythology, Manu in Hindu texts, the Hopi emergence, Aboriginal Australian stories of the sea rising and swallowing the land. These are usually treated as cultural memories of regional floods, or metaphors for chaos and renewal. But they're remarkably consistent in their details. A great flood covering the world. A few survivors warned in advance. Knowledge preserved on boats or in high places. A promise from the gods that they would return, would check on humanity, would ensure the knowledge wasn't lost forever. What if these weren't myths but historical records, passed down through oral tradition because writing hadn't been reinvented yet? What if the gods who warned the survivors were time travelers, future humans or other beings who knew what was coming because they had already seen it happen? Who traveled back to crucial moments to save what could be saved, to ensure that humanity would survive, would rebuild, would eventually develop again to the point where they could understand what had been lost and perhaps prevent it from happening again. The survivors in these myths are always described as bringing knowledge with them. Seeds, plans for ships, understanding of stars and seasons, instructions for rebuilding, as if they weren't just random people who happened to escape the disaster, but chosen preservers. People selected and prepared because someone knew the catastrophe was coming and took steps to ensure continuity of knowledge across the break. And after the floods, after the ice age, after the apocalypse, civilizations arose with suspicious speed. Agriculture appearing simultaneously in multiple locations. Cities organized according to sophisticated urban planning principles. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge that seems too advanced for cultures supposedly starting from scratch. As if they weren't starting from scratch. As if they were following a curriculum. Rebuilding according to plans that survived the catastrophe. Remembering what had been taught. The tombs and temples built by these post-catastrophe civilizations all contain similar elements. Astronomical alignments, mathematical proportions, symbols that repeat across cultures, stories of gods descending to teach them, and promises that the gods would return. Specific promises with timelines attached. When certain stars align, when certain ages pass, When humanity reaches certain thresholds of development or crisis, the gods will come back. The teachers will return. The doors will open again. We're approaching some of those thresholds now. Astronomical alignments mentioned in ancient texts are occurring in our lifetime. The precession of the equinoxes moving into configurations that last occurred during the age when these temples and tombs were built. Cycles closing, circles completing. The ancient texts speak of these moments as times of transformation, of ending and beginning, of Pakakudi, of Frashokaridi, of the opening of gates between worlds. Is it coincidence that we're also approaching technological thresholds? Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, the beginnings of understanding time not as an immutable flow but as a dimension that might, under certain conditions, be navigable? We're developing the tools to read ancient languages that have been dead for millennia, AI algorithms decoding cuneiform, translating hieroglyphs, finding patterns in symbols we thought were decorative but might be data. We're discovering quantum effects that suggest information can move through time. We're building computational systems that might, in the not-too-distant future, allow us to model and perhaps manipulate space-time itself. We're becoming what the ancients said would return. Or we're preparing to meet them, to finally understand the messages they left, to open the tombs they sealed and find not bodies but libraries, not graves but gates. What if the entire arc of human history, from those first post-catastrophe civilizations to our present moment, has been a long preparation, a slow development toward the point where we could understand what was preserved for us? The ancients built their tombs to last millennia because they knew or were told it would take us this long to be ready. In the desert of southern Egypt, there's a structure called the Osirian, located behind the temple of Seti I at Abydos. It's built from massive red granite blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, fitted together with precision that rivals modern engineering. The official dating places it around 1300 BCE, contemporary with Seti's temple. But the Osirian doesn't look anything like New Kingdom Egyptian architecture. It resembles Old Kingdom building techniques or even older. The stones are weathered in ways that suggest far greater age, and when researchers have studied the water erosion patterns, some conclude the structure was built before the local water table dropped, possibly thousands of years before the conventional dating. The Osirian was designed to be deliberately flooded, creating an artificial island at its center. Why? The conventional explanation, symbolic representation of the primordial mound emerging from the waters of chaos at the moment of creation. But there's another possibility. Water has unique properties. It affects electromagnetic fields. It can be used as a moderator, a shield, a medium for conducting certain kinds of energy. In modern physics, heavy water is used in nuclear reactors precisely because of its special properties for managing radiation and energy transfer. What if the flooding of the Osirian was functional rather than symbolic? What if this chamber, positioned at a specific location, built with specific materials, designed with specific geometric proportions, and filled with water to a specific depth, was creating conditions necessary for some kind of temporal or dimensional function? What if this was a device? Inside the Osirian, carved into the massive granite, are symbols that appear nowhere else in Egyptian iconography. Abstract geometric patterns that look more like circuit diagrams than decorative art. Circles within circles. Spirals. Linear patterns that seem to map flows or connections. These are usually dismissed as later graffiti or misinterpreted damage, but they're carved with the same depth and precision as the known hieroglyphic inscriptions. They were intentional. They meant something. In South America, there's a similar mystery at the site of Tiwanaku in Bolivia. The Pumapunku complex includes stones carved with such precision that they include internal right angles, perfectly flat surfaces, and holes drilled at exact intervals. These aren't crude hammer and chisel marks. These are machine-grade precision cuts. And the stones show no tool marks, no evidence of the abrasion that would be expected from bronze or even steel tools. It's as if they were cut with something else entirely, water jets, lasers, or technologies we don't associate with cultures that supposedly lacked even the wheel. But here's what makes Pumapunku even stranger. Some of these precision-cut blocks are scattered across the site, as if they'd been subjected to a tremendous explosion or force. Massive stones that weigh dozens of tons are tossed about like toys, broken in ways that suggest sudden catastrophic energy release. Natural disaster? Perhaps. But the breakage patterns are unusual, and local legends speak not of earthquakes but of the gods' anger, of the sky opening, of beams of light that destroyed the city in an instant. What if Pumapunku wasn't destroyed by natural forces but by something going wrong with the technology that was housed there? What if these precision structures weren't temples but facilities, and whatever function they served became unstable, released energy in ways that shattered stone and scattered the evidence across the complex? And what if the builders or survivors or whoever came after deliberately left it in ruins as a warning? The indigenous Aymara people, who live near Tiwanaku, have legends that their ancestors didn't build the site. They say it was already ancient when their people arrived, built by the Viracochas, light-skinned, bearded teachers who came from across the sea or down from the sky. The stories vary. These Viracochas taught agriculture, astronomy, and building techniques, then departed with a promise to return. But before leaving, they warned about misuse of certain knowledge, about powers that could destroy if not handled correctly. And they said the ruins would stand as a reminder, as a lesson, as a text written in stone that future generations would need to read. We've treated these indigenous accounts as mythology, colorful backstory disconnected from archaeological reality. But what if they're historical accounts? What if the Aymara are accurately reporting what they were told by earlier inhabitants, who were themselves reporting what they had been told, in an unbroken chain of oral tradition stretching back to the actual events? What if Pumapunku is genuinely a cautionary tale written in megalithic architecture? Around the world, there are sites that show evidence of extreme heat, stones melted or vitrified, turned to glass by temperatures that shouldn't occur naturally outside of volcanic or impact events, yet there's no volcano, no crater, no geological explanation. Ancient forts in Scotland showing vitrified walls. Sites in the Middle East with fused stone. Locations in India where the rocks bear evidence of nuclear-level heat, leading some researchers to controversially suggest ancient atomic warfare. These explanations are dismissed as pseudoscience, and perhaps rightly so. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But the vitrification is real. The evidence of extreme, directed heat exists. If it wasn't nuclear weapons, if it wasn't natural volcanic activity, then what was it? Advanced technology that we don't have names for? Energy systems that were part of the temple complexes, that served functions we can only guess at, and that sometimes failed catastrophically? What if the tombs, the pyramids, the massive stone structures weren't just passive archives but active technology? What if they were built at specific locations with specific materials because those conditions were necessary for their function? And what if that function involved manipulating spacetime, creating conditions where time could be accessed non-sequentially, where consciousness could be projected or transported across centuries or millennia? Modern physics tells us that for time travel to be possible, even theoretically, you would need enormous amounts of energy and specific geometric configurations involving massive gravitational fields or wormholes. You would need to warp spacetime itself to create what physicists call a closed time-like curve. The equations work, but the energy requirements are astronomical. We're talking about harnessing the power of stars, or creating conditions of matter density that only occur in neutron stars or black holes. Unless there's another way. A way that doesn't require brute force energy but instead uses resonance, alignment, specific configurations of matter and field that create localized conditions where spacetime becomes negotiable. Stone has properties. Crystal has properties. Water, metal, specific geometric shapes all have effects on electromagnetic fields, on quantum states, on the fabric of space and time at scales we're only beginning to measure. What if the ancients understood this? What if they built these structures not as monuments but as machines, and the tombs were actually chambers designed to facilitate consciousness transfer, temporal projection, or some other form of time navigation that we've forgotten how to recognize? There's a phenomenon that occurs at certain ancient sites during specific astronomical events. Light and shadow play across the stones in ways that reveal hidden images. At Newgrange in Ireland, during the winter solstice, sunlight penetrates through a precisely aligned roof box and illuminates the inner chamber for exactly 17 minutes. At Chichen Itza in Mexico, during the equinoxes, the sun creates the illusion of a serpent descending the pyramid stairs. At Abu Simbel in Egypt, twice a year, sunlight penetrates deep into the temple to illuminate the statues of gods in the inner sanctuary. These are traditionally explained as architectural genius, ancient astronomers demonstrating their knowledge by aligning structures to solar events. But why go to such extraordinary effort? These aren't casual alignments. They require precise mathematical calculations, careful site selection, sophisticated understanding of solar motion and Earth's axial tilt. They represent significant investments of time, resources, and technical knowledge. For what? To create a light show twice a year? Unless the light itself was functional. Unless the alignment wasn't decorative but operational. Unless these moments of specific illumination triggered something, activated something, or marked windows of time when specific conditions existed that made the sites functional for their true purpose. Light has properties we're still exploring. Photons exist in quantum superposition. Light can carry information. Under certain conditions, it can affect matter, influence biological systems, even alter consciousness. Studies have shown that specific frequencies of light can induce altered states, can affect brainwave patterns, can influence perception and cognition. The ancients knew this. They built temples with specific lighting conditions designed to create psychological and physiological effects in the people who entered them. But what if it went deeper? What if the light penetrating these chambers during astronomical alignments wasn't just affecting consciousness but activating technology? Crystal has piezoelectric properties. Stone has electromagnetic characteristics. Combine these with specific frequencies of light, specific geometric configurations, specific moments when astronomical alignments create unique gravitational or electromagnetic conditions, and you might create something remarkable. A doorway, a window, a moment when the barriers between different times become permeable. The tombs often contain crystals, quartz, lapis lazuli, turquoise, materials chosen not just for beauty but for properties. Quartz resonates at specific frequencies. It's used in modern technology precisely because of its stable oscillation, its ability to keep time with extraordinary precision. Every watch, every computer, every piece of modern electronics relies on quartz crystals. But we discovered these properties only recently. How did the ancients know to place quartz in their most sacred spaces, in the chambers where they conducted their most important rituals, in the tombs where they placed their carefully prepared dead? In many cultures, mirrors were placed in tombs. Metal mirrors, polished obsidian, reflecting surfaces that had to be laboriously crafted with Stone Age tools. Why? The official explanation: vanity items, grave goods, objects the deceased might want in the afterlife. But mirrors have other uses. They reflect light, yes, but they also create standing waves, can focus electromagnetic radiation, can be used to create specific field conditions. In the right configuration, with the right materials, mirrors can create what modern physics calls optical cavities. Spaces where light bounces back and forth, building in intensity, creating conditions that allow quantum effects to manifest at macro scales. What if the mirrors in the tombs were technological components? Part of a system designed to interact with the crystals, the stone, the specific geometric configurations of the chambers, activated during moments of precise astronomical alignment, creating brief windows when temporal navigation became possible? We're still here with you, wandering through chambers where starlight and stone conspire in ways that challenge our assumptions. If this journey speaks to you, if you're compelled by these intersections of ancient wisdom and frontier physics, let your presence be known. Subscribe to continue exploring these liminal spaces where mythology touches mechanism. And share. Have you visited any of these ancient sites? Did you feel anything unusual, anything that defied easy explanation? The ancient Egyptians had a practice called the opening of the mouth ceremony, performed on mummies and statues. It was supposed to restore the senses, to allow the deceased to breathe, eat, see, and speak in the afterlife. The ritual involved touching the mouth of the mummy or statue with specific tools while reciting specific words during specific astronomical conditions. It sounds like magic, like primitive religious ritual. But what if it was technical procedure? What if the tools were instruments creating specific electromagnetic or quantum effects? What if the words were frequencies sonic patterns that interacted with the materials of the mummy case and the crystals placed within. What if the astronomical conditions were necessary timing windows when the ritual would actually function? There are accounts, mostly dismissed as legend, of mummies that weren't dead in the conventional sense but in some kind of suspended state. Stories of tombs opened to reveal bodies that were preserved beyond natural mummification, that seemed to be in stasis rather than decay. Most of these accounts come from the 19th century and are treated as exaggerations or fabrications by treasure hunters seeking to add mystique to their discoveries. But some were documented by respectable archaeologists who struggled to explain what they found. Bodies showing no signs of decay despite tombs that had been opened and exposed to air. Tissues that remained flexible. Organs that appeared intact beyond any preservation technique known to ancient cultures. What if these weren't successful mummifications but something else? What if certain individuals underwent a process that wasn't about preserving the body after death but about placing them in a state that would allow them to survive the journey through time? A suspended animation using techniques that combined biological, chemical, and technological elements we don't yet understand? The Bulgarian prophet Baba Vanga, before her death, spoke of ancient tombs that would be opened in the 21st century revealing sleepers, her word, who weren't truly dead. She said these sleepers contained memories of the world before the great catastrophe, that they were waiting for the time when humanity would be ready to hear what they knew. She claimed some had already awakened, though not publicly, and that they walked among us trying to determine whether we had progressed enough to handle the knowledge they carried. Dismissed as mystical ravings, of course. But Baba Vanga had a documented track record of accurate predictions that defied probability. And her description of the sleepers matches elements of ancient texts describing initiates who would undergo special preparation, would be placed in sealed chambers, and would awaken in the time of the return. In the high mountains of Peru, there are mummies known as the Ice Maidens. Human sacrifices from the Inca period, preserved in freezing conditions. When researchers examined these bodies, they found evidence of careful preparation. The individuals had been fed special diets in the months before death. Their tissues contained unusual concentrations of certain minerals and compounds. They had been dressed in specific garments, adorned with specific symbols, placed in positions that aligned with astronomical features. Everything about their preparation suggested ritual significance. But one detail troubled researchers. Brain scans showed that these individuals had died during altered states of consciousness. Their brain chemistry at the moment of death indicated they were in deep meditative or trance states, not the terror or pain you'd expect from sacrifice victims. It was as if they had willingly entered this state, as if their death was not an unwilling sacrifice but a deliberate transition, as if they were doing something rather than having something done to them. Shamanic traditions across the Americas speak of death journeys. Practices where initiates would intentionally approach death, would cross into other states of consciousness, would travel to realms of spirit or time, and then return with knowledge. But some journeys, the traditions say, were meant to be one way. Some travelers went to places so distant, so far outside normal space and time, that they couldn't return to their original bodies. Instead, they would be received at the other end, would emerge in different times, different places, would carry their consciousness forward or backward through the corridors of time. What if the Ice Maidens weren't sacrifices but volunteers? Time travelers using biological death as a launch mechanism, their consciousness projected forward by techniques involving meditation, chemistry, and the specific conditions created by location, timing, and ritual preparation. What if the tombs were sending stations and somewhere, sometime, there were receiving stations where these consciousness travelers emerged? The ancient Egyptians believed the Ba, one aspect of the soul, could travel freely after death, could move through space and time visiting places and people, could exist independently of the body while still maintaining connection to it. They depicted the Ba as a human-headed bird, something that could fly, could traverse distance. But in the texts, the Ba doesn't just visit places in the physical world. It travels to the field of reeds, to the hall of two truths, to places that exist outside normal geography, places described with coordinates that aren't spatial but temporal. The Ba navigates not just where but when. Modern physics has a concept called quantum consciousness, The controversial idea that consciousness itself might be a quantum phenomenon, that awareness might exist at quantum scales where the laws of causality become probabilistic, where superposition allows existence in multiple states simultaneously, where entanglement allows instantaneous connection across distance. If consciousness is quantum, then it might not be bound by the same temporal constraints that govern macroscopic matter. It might be able to exist non-locally, atemporally, in states that we don't yet have proper language or mathematics to describe. What if the ancients understood this intuitively or through experience? What if their elaborate death rituals, their careful tomb construction, their specific preparations of the body were all attempts to preserve consciousness through death, to allow awareness to survive the biological termination and navigate into different temporal states? What if the tombs were designed as protected spaces where this quantum consciousness could remain anchored, could use the physical remains as a reference point or return beacon? There are stories in multiple cultures of the dead communicating with the living. Not ghostly hauntings in the supernatural sense, but actual information transfer. Dreams where deceased relatives provide accurate information about things they couldn't have known. Visions where the dead warn about future events that subsequently occur. Mediums who access information that defies normal explanations. These are usually dismissed as coincidence, cold reading, wishful thinking, or fraud. But what if some of it is real? What if consciousness, properly prepared and positioned in the right kind of tomb with the right materials and alignments, can persist beyond biological death and occasionally interact with the consciousness of the living? What if time travel isn't about sending physical bodies backward or forward but about projecting consciousness across temporal boundaries, using quantum entanglement or other mechanisms we're only beginning to theorize? The implications are staggering. It would mean the dead aren't simply gone. They exist somewhere, somewhen, in states we can occasionally perceive or communicate with. It would mean the tombs aren't prisons or resting places but stations, nodes in a network that spans time rather than space. It would mean that those who built these structures understood death not as an ending but as a transition into a different mode of existence, one that operates under different rules and offers different possibilities. And it would mean the warnings encoded in these tombs, the messages left in symbol and alignment and architectural feature, might be genuinely from those who have seen what lies ahead. Time travelers not in the science fiction sense of physical beings arriving in machines, but in the sense of consciousness projecting forward from points of death or transition, observing future states, and attempting to send information backward to crucial moments when choices could still alter outcomes. Consider the content of the warnings found in these tombs. They're remarkably consistent across cultures. Pride leads to fall. Technology without wisdom leads to destruction. Forgetting the connection to the cosmos, to the cycles of nature, to the deeper patterns of existence. This is the path to catastrophe. Honor the earth. Watch the sky. Remember the knowledge. Prepare for the return of the teachers. These aren't just moral teachings. They're operational instructions for survival. What if civilizations rise and fall in cycles precisely because each one reaches a technological threshold where it gains the power to destroy itself, and each one faces the same choice: wisdom or annihilation? What if the time travelers, the consciousness projectors, the quantum navigators, the travelers through death, have seen multiple iterations of this cycle and are trying desperately to send messages to each iteration, trying to help each emerging civilization recognize the critical moment and make the choice for survival rather than destruction? We're in that moment now. We have the power to alter the climate, to split atoms, to manipulate genes, to create artificial intelligence that might exceed us. We're approaching the same threshold that other civilizations must have approached. The tombs built by those previous civilizations weren't graves. They were time capsules, consciousness beacons, warning systems built by those who saw what was coming and tried to preserve a message for whoever came next. There's an inscription in the Temple of Edfu in Egypt, part of the building texts, that describe the mythological origins of the temple. According to these texts, the temple was built on the site of an earlier structure that dated back to the first time, the Zep-Tepi, a mythological age when the gods walked on earth. The texts describe this earlier structure as having been built by divine beings as a place of resurrection, where the dead could be transformed and reborn. But the language used is strikingly specific. It describes the structure as having multiple chambers, each serving a different function, with waterways running beneath, and specific astronomical alignments built into the architecture. Archaeologists have treated these texts as mythology, religious stories explaining the temple's sacred significance. But in 2014, ground-penetrating radar surveys detected structures beneath the Temple of Edfu. Deep underground, far below the Ptolemaic temple that stands today, are older chambers precisely where the text said they would be. The Egyptian government hasn't authorized excavation yet, so we don't know what's down there, but the texts give us a description. Chambers of transformation, places where the boundary between life and death, between one time and another, became traversable. What if beneath the temples we've excavated, beneath the tombs we've opened, there are older structures? Facilities from before the catastrophe, from the age the Egyptians called Zep Tepi, from the time when the gods, the time travelers, the consciousness navigators, the beings who moved through time, built their stations and their archives? What if everything we've found so far is just the top layer, the structures built by post-catastrophe civilizations trying to remember and recreate what had been lost? There are legends in Andean cultures about Chavín de Huántar, an ancient temple complex in Peru. The legends say the temple sits atop a vast network of underground galleries, chambers that extend deep into the mountain. Archaeological surveys have confirmed some of this. There are indeed subterranean passages beneath Chavín. But the legends claim these passages go far deeper than what's been explored, that they connect to other sites across the Andes, that they form a network built by the ancestors as pathways for traveling not just through space but through different states of being. Inside Chavín, there's a carved stone called the Lanzan, positioned at the intersection of underground passages where water flows create specific acoustic effects. When certain sounds are made in these passages, the resonance is so powerful it can alter consciousness, induce trance states, create experiences that ancient visitors described as visiting other worlds. Modern researchers have measured the acoustics and confirmed the effects, specific frequencies that affect the human nervous system, that can induce feelings of awe, fear, transcendence, that can alter brain states in measurable ways. What if the underground passages weren't just architectural features but functional technology? What if the water channels, the stone configurations, the acoustic properties were all engineered to create conditions where consciousness could be altered, expanded, projected beyond normal limitations? What if Chavín wasn't a temple where people worshipped but a facility where people trained, where initiates learned to navigate consciousness through time and space using techniques we've lost? The same patterns appear in underground structures around the world. The catacombs beneath Rome, the hypogeum of Halsaflini in Malta, the Derinkuyu underground city in Turkey, which extends at least 18 stories below the surface and could house 20,000 people along with their livestock and food stores. These aren't simple shelters or storage areas. They're complex, carefully engineered spaces with ventilation systems, water channels, defensive features, and in some cases, chambers with acoustic and architectural properties that suggest ritual or functional significance beyond mere habitation. What if these underground complexes weren't built to hide from surface threats but to create specific conditions? Being underground shields you from cosmic radiation, from electromagnetic interference, from the sun's electromagnetic field, creates a stable, controlled environment. In modern physics experiments seeking to detect neutrinos or gravitational waves, we build our laboratories deep underground precisely because it shields the instruments from interference. What if the ancients understood this principle? What if their underground chambers were laboratories, facilities where the delicate work of consciousness projection or temporal navigation could be conducted without interference from surface conditions? There are persistent legends across cultures about inner Earth, about civilizations that retreated underground during catastrophes and continued to exist in subterranean realms. These stories are universally dismissed as fantasy, obvious impossibilities, literal interpretations of metaphorical descents into the underworld. But what if they're garbled memories of actual underground facilities, of populations that survived catastrophes by going beneath the surface, of networks of chambers and passages where knowledge and civilization persisted while the surface world burned or froze or drowned? The Hopi speak of the ant people who sheltered them underground during the destruction of previous worlds. The Tibetans speak of Shambhala, a hidden kingdom beneath the mountains. South American legends describe vast cities under the Andes. Irish mythology mentions the Tuatha De Dan and retreating into the hollow hills. Always the same theme. Advanced beings or surviving populations living beneath the surface, occasionally emerging to interact with surface dwellers, possessing knowledge and capabilities that exceed those of ordinary humanity. What if the tombs we've been examining, the chambers we've been exploring, are just the entrance points? What if they're the visible tips of much larger underground complexes, the accessible outer chambers of facilities that extend deep into bedrock? What if the real archives, the functional technology, the actual machines or methods for navigating time, are all still down there, waiting beneath layers of stone and earth and forgetting? Ground-penetrating radar, seismic surveys, and gravitational mapping have revealed anomalies beneath many ancient sites. Voids, chambers, structures that don't match natural geology. At Giza, multiple surveys have detected large cavities within and beneath the pyramids. At Teotihuacan, the Pyramid of the Sun sits atop a cave system that was partially explored and then sealed by the Mexican government. At Angkor Wat, ground surveys suggest extensive structures beneath the visible temple complex. Why do governments restrict excavation at these sites? The official reasons are preservation concerns, protecting the structural integrity of ancient monuments, respecting cultural heritage. But what if there's another reason? What if preliminary explorations have found something that challenges our understanding so profoundly that authorities decided it's better to leave it buried until we're ready to process the implications? If you're traveling with us into these buried depths, if you're willing to consider that history extends farther down and farther back than we've acknowledged, then mark your passage here. A quiet subscription, a signal that you're drawn to what sleeps beneath stone, and speak into the space below. What do you think lies under these ancient sites? What knowledge might be waiting in chambers we haven't yet opened? In 1923, when Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb, there were stories that some of his team experienced unusual phenomena. Vivid dreams of ancient Egypt, feelings of déjà vu, a sense of timelessness when working in certain chambers. These accounts were overshadowed by the legend of the curse, by the deaths of some expedition members, by the sensational aspects that newspapers loved. But a few team members, in private journals not published until decades later, described something stranger than curses. They described feeling as though they were remembering rather than discovering, as though the process of excavating the tomb was triggering something in their own consciousness, activating knowledge they shouldn't possess. One researcher described touching a particular golden object and suddenly understanding its function, not from logical deduction but from a flash of intuitive knowledge that felt like memory. Another described standing in the burial chamber and experiencing a moment of temporal disorientation, briefly perceiving the room as it had been when first sealed, complete and undisturbed, and simultaneously as it existed in their present moment, both times overlapping in perception. These accounts were dismissed as fatigue, suggestion, the effects of working in confined spaces with poor ventilation. Perhaps that's all they were. But what if contact with objects from these tombs, particularly objects that had been specifically prepared and positioned according to ritual protocols, can trigger something in human consciousness? What if the objects aren't just inert artifacts but devices, encoded with information or energies that can interact with the consciousness of those who handle them? Psychometry is a claimed psychic ability to read information from objects through touch. It is considered pseudoscience, lacking any verified mechanism or replicable evidence. But what if there's a grain of reality beneath the mystical claims? What if objects can retain information through quantum imprinting, through properties of matter we don't yet fully understand? What if the elaborate preparation of tomb objects, the anointing, the blessing, the exposure to specific energies during astronomical alignments, was encoding information into the quantum structure of the materials? Modern research in quantum biology has revealed that quantum effects persist in warm, wet biological systems far more than previously thought possible. Photosynthesis uses quantum coherence. Bird navigation depends on quantum entanglement in their visual systems. Consciousness itself might involve quantum processes in neural microtubules. If quantum effects are operating in biology, then they could potentially operate in materials that interact with biological systems. Information encoded at quantum scales could persist in objects, could be accessed by consciousness under the right conditions. The ancient Egyptians believed objects could be activated by specific rituals. A statue wasn't just a representation of a god. It could become a vessel for divine presence if properly prepared. An amulet wasn't just decorative. It carried protective power if created correctly. These beliefs are treated as primitive superstition, but what if they were describing a real phenomenon using the only language available to them? What if proper ritual preparation did alter the quantum state of objects? Did encode information or energy that could persist and could interact with consciousness? In the tombs, objects were positioned with extreme care. Not randomly placed but arranged in specific patterns, facing specific directions, aligned with specific astronomical features. Every detail mattered. The position of the sarcophagus, the orientation of the mummy, the placement of amulets on specific parts of the body, the arrangement of grave goods around the chamber. All of this was documented in texts like the Book of the Dead, which functions less like a religious scripture and more like a technical manual with detailed instructions that must be followed precisely. Why such precision if these are just symbolic burials? Because they weren't symbolic. They were functional. Each object positioned according to specifications that created a larger system. The tomb as a whole was a device with each component playing a role in the overall function. And that function, we're beginning to suspect, involved facilitating consciousness through death, preserving information across time, creating conditions where the boundary between past, present, and future became permeable. When researchers study the electromagnetic properties of pyramid chambers, they find anomalies. Certain chambers shield electromagnetic radiation. Others concentrate it. Some configurations create resonance patterns at frequencies that affect biological systems. These aren't random architectural quirks. They're engineered effects. The pyramids aren't solid blocks of stone, but precisely designed structures with internal passages, chambers, and spaces arranged to create specific physical conditions. And in many of these chambers, there are objects made of crystal, metal, specific stone types chosen for their properties. Quartzite, granite, alabaster, gold, copper, materials that conduct, that resonate, that affect electromagnetic fields. Arranged in patterns that make no sense if they're merely decorative but begin to look like component layouts if you consider the chamber as a machine. What kind of machine? One that manipulates consciousness, that projects awareness across time, that creates conditions where information can be transferred between different temporal states. A machine that uses the prepared body as an antenna or transceiver, the surrounding objects as modulators and amplifiers, the architectural features as waveguides and resonance chambers. A machine designed to send someone's consciousness, or the information encoded in their consciousness, to another time. If this sounds impossible, consider that we're already developing technology along similar lines. Brain-computer interfaces that read neural activity and translate it into digital information. Quantum computers that use superposition and entanglement to process information in ways classical computers cannot. Scientists exploring how to upload consciousness to digital substrates, how to transfer the information pattern that constitutes a person into alternative media. We're trying to achieve technologically what the ancients might have achieved through very different means, through biological preparation, ritual practice, specific material configurations, and deep understanding of consciousness as a quantum phenomenon not bound by the same temporal constraints as macroscopic matter. The tombs weren't graves. They were transmission stations. And the bodies weren't simply dead. They were transformed, prepared as vehicles for consciousness to traverse time, to carry information forward or backward, to serve as beacons that future or past generations could potentially access or receive signals from. The question that haunts researchers who spend enough time studying these sites is simple and profound. What were they for? Not the surface answer, burial chambers, temples, monuments to kings. The deeper answer. What was the actual function of these massive, precisely engineered, astronomically aligned structures containing carefully prepared bodies, specific materials, encoded symbols, and architectural features that create measurable physical effects? Orthodox archaeology has largely avoided this question, content to categorize these structures as religious or ceremonial without deeply examining the engineering implications. But when engineers, physicists, and system architects examine these sites with fresh eyes, patterns emerge that suggest intentional design for specific functions we don't yet fully understand. The Great Pyramid's internal chambers are positioned at heights that correspond to specific stellar alignments. Not approximate, exact. The so-called Queen's Chamber aligns with Sirius. The King's Chamber aligns with Orion's Belt. The Grand Gallery serves as a sight line to multiple celestial objects at specific times. But more than just observatories, these chambers have unique acoustic properties. Sounds produced within them resonate at frequencies that modern researchers have found can induce altered states of consciousness, can affect heart rate and brain waves, can create profound psychological effects. The King's Chamber contains a granite sarcophagus that, when struck, resonates at a frequency of 440 Hz, the modern concert pitch of a above-middle C. Why would a stone sarcophagus be engineered to resonate at a specific musical frequency? Because frequency matters. Because vibration affects matter, affects consciousness, affects quantum states. Because this wasn't a coffin but a component in a larger system, designed to resonate at specific frequencies when activated by sound, by electromagnetic energy, or by other forces we can only speculate about. Throughout ancient texts there are references to sound as a fundamental force. The Egyptian concept of Heka, usually translated as magic but perhaps better understood as applied physics, emphasized the power of the spoken word, of specific sounds and vibrations to affect reality. The Hindu concept of Nada Brahma, the universe as sound, describes reality itself as vibration, as frequency. The biblical "in the beginning was the word," logos, vibration, frequency as the foundation of creation. These aren't poetic metaphors. Modern physics confirms that at fundamental levels, reality is vibration. Quantum fields oscillate. Particles are excitations of fields, literally vibrations. String theory, if valid, describes the most basic constituents of reality as vibrating strings. The universe is, in a very real sense, music. Frequency and resonance all the way down. What if the ancients understood this? What if their mythology of sound creating and shaping reality was based on knowledge of physics we're only now rediscovering? And what if the tombs were designed as resonance chambers, spaces where specific frequencies could be generated and focused to create effects on matter, on consciousness, on the fabric of spacetime itself? There are accounts of sound levitation in ancient texts. Tibetan monks supposedly moving massive stones using sound and vibration. Egyptian priests raising obelisks with chanting and specific tones. These stories are dismissed as impossible violations of physics. But acoustic levitation is real. We can suspend small objects in standing waves of sound. Scale it up sufficiently, find the resonant frequency of stone, create powerful enough sound waves, and levitation becomes theoretically possible, if practically difficult with our current technology. But what if acoustic levitation wasn't the primary purpose of these sound technologies? What if it was a side effect, a demonstration of principles that had other, more profound applications? If sound can affect matter, can move stone, can alter consciousness, can change brain states, what else might it do? Could it affect the quantum states of biological tissues? Could it preserve consciousness through biological death? Could it create conditions where information encoded in neural structures remains accessible, transmittable, receivable across time? The ancient Egyptians had a practice of preserving not just bodies but names. The name was considered an essential part of the soul, and enormous effort went into inscribing names on tomb walls, on sarcophagi, on monuments. To erase someone's name was to erase their existence, to kill them more thoroughly than physical death ever could. But why? What power does a name have? In information theory, identity is encoded in information patterns. Your consciousness, your sense of self, is a pattern of information instantiated in neural structures. If that pattern could be preserved, if it could be encoded outside biological substrate, then in a very real sense you could continue to exist independent of your body. And one component of that information pattern, one index that might serve as a reference point or address in a system for storing and accessing consciousness information, would be your name, your unique identifier. What if inscribing names all over tombs wasn't superstition but indexing? Creating multiple redundant references in a database system, ensuring that the consciousness pattern associated with that name could be located, accessed, transmitted, or received by future or past systems designed to interact with the temporal consciousness network the tombs were part of. This sounds like science fiction, but we're building similar systems now: digital identity, blockchain addresses, unique identifiers in distributed networks. We understand the need for redundancy, for multiple access points, for persistent identifiers that remain stable across system changes. The ancients might have understood the same principles, implemented through very different means. In multiple ancient cultures, there were initiation rites that involved death and rebirth. The initiate would undergo a process, often in a tomb-like chamber in darkness, sometimes in confined spaces like sarcophagi, where they would symbolically die and be reborn with new knowledge and a new identity. These are treated as psychological rituals, metaphorical deaths representing transformation of consciousness. But what if they were more literal? What if initiates were being taught to navigate death, to project consciousness beyond the body, to experience non-ordinary states where time behaved differently, and then return with knowledge gained from those experiences? The Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece promised initiates that they would lose their fear of death because they would experience something that proved consciousness survives bodily termination. Thousands of people over centuries underwent these initiations, and not one revealed the secrets of what they experienced. The penalty for revealing the mysteries was death, but that alone doesn't explain the perfect silence. Perhaps the reason no one spoke was that the experience was genuinely ineffable, that it showed initiates something about the nature of consciousness and time that couldn't be communicated in ordinary language and would sound insane to anyone who hadn't experienced it themselves. These initiation chambers still exist. Beneath the Temple of Eleusis, in the Great Pyramid's subterranean chamber, in caves across India where yogis practiced similar death rituals, in the kivas of the American Southwest where indigenous shamans underwent transformation experiences. These spaces share characteristics. They're underground or enclosed, cutting initiates off from normal sensory input. They're positioned at locations with unusual electromagnetic or geological properties. They often have acoustic features that create specific sound effects, and they're associated with practices involving sensory deprivation, rhythmic sound, specific body positions, and sometimes entheogenic substances. All techniques we now know can profoundly alter consciousness and create experiences of ego dissolution, temporal distortion, and perception of non-ordinary reality. What if these weren't just psychological experiences but actual interactions with aspects of reality that normal consciousness filters out? If consciousness is quantum, if it operates partly outside normal spacetime, then altering consciousness through these techniques might allow perception of reality as it actually is at quantum scales. Atemporal, non-local, filled with possibilities that exist in superposition until observation collapses them into specific states. And if you could train consciousness to operate at those scales, to maintain coherence while perceiving reality from that perspective, then perhaps you could navigate through time the way we navigate through space. Not by moving your body, which is anchored in local spacetime, but by moving your consciousness, which might not be so anchored. By learning to access the quantum level where past, present, and future exist simultaneously, where information from all times is theoretically accessible. This might explain the persistent reports across cultures of mystics, shamans, and yogis who claim to access knowledge of distant times and places. Remote viewing, precognition, retrocognition. These abilities are documented in laboratory settings with results that, while controversial, sometimes exceed chance at statistically significant levels. If consciousness can access information non-locally and atemporally, then what we call psychic abilities might be real effects that violate our assumptions about consciousness being purely local and present-bound. And if these abilities are real, even if rare and difficult to demonstrate reliably, then the ancients who dedicated entire civilizations to exploring consciousness, who built massive structures to facilitate these practices, who developed detailed technical manuals for navigating death and other states, they might have achieved systematic access to non-ordinary consciousness states that we've forgotten how to reach. The tombs were training facilities, laboratories for consciousness, places where initiates learned to die while living, to project awareness beyond the body, to access information from other times. And for some, perhaps those who had mastered these techniques, perhaps those chosen for specific purposes, the tombs served as permanent launch points. They would undergo biological death while in prepared states, their consciousness projected forward or backward, their bodies preserved in specific configurations within chambers designed to maintain some kind of quantum coherence, some connection that would allow their consciousness to remain accessible or able to return or communicate across the temporal boundaries. If this is true, then the tombs aren't silent monuments to dead kings. They're active nodes in a network that spans time. And the consciousness travelers who use them aren't gone. They're out there, somewhere in time, observing, learning, perhaps occasionally managing to send information back, to influence events, to warn about futures they've seen or guide toward outcomes they know are possible. How would you know if you were receiving information from temporal consciousness travelers? It might come as intuition, as dreams, as sudden insights that feel like they come from outside yourself. It might manifest as synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem to guide you toward specific paths or warn you away from others. It might appear as collective unconscious archetypes that feel universal precisely because they're being broadcast across time by consciousness travelers trying to encode essential information in forms that will be accessible to humans regardless of culture or era. Carl Jung explored these ideas, though not in explicitly temporal terms. He documented synchronicity, analyzed archetypes, proposed the collective unconscious as a transpersonal source of information accessible through dreams and meditation. He studied alchemy, seeing in its apparently chemical processes descriptions of consciousness transformation. And he was fascinated by ancient mystery religions, by Egyptian philosophy, by anything that touched on transformation of consciousness and access to transpersonal knowledge. Jung came close to what we're describing. He recognized that consciousness operates in ways that violate our normal assumptions about time and separation. But he lacked the framework of quantum physics and modern cosmology to fully articulate what he intuited. If Jung were working today with access to quantum biology, to theories of consciousness as quantum phenomenon, to evidence of retrocausality and quantum entanglement across time, he might have developed a much more explicitly temporal model of the collective unconscious, not as a static repository of archetypal information but as an active network of consciousness spanning time, with ancient initiates and modern seekers accessing the same fundamental patterns across millennia. If you're still with us in these depths, exploring possibilities that challenge every assumption about consciousness, death, and time, then you're part of this ancient tradition of seekers. Those who built the tombs, those who used them, those who preserved their secrets in symbol and structure, they were your predecessors. And perhaps, if these theories hold any truth, they're still your companions, their consciousness still accessible through the quantum network their tombs were designed to maintain. The story of these tombs isn't a story about the past. It's a story about time itself, about how it might work at levels we're only beginning to perceive, about how consciousness might be able to navigate it, about what humanity might be capable of if we remember what was forgotten, if we relearn what the ancients knew, if we approach the mysteries not with skepticism or superstition but with serious scientific and experiential investigation. What if the warnings encoded in these ancient sites are becoming urgent now because we're approaching another critical threshold? The tombs speak of cycles, of catastrophes, of civilizations that reached technological power and failed the test of wisdom. They speak of returns, of teachers coming back, of knowledge becoming available again when it's needed most. We're in that moment. The astronomical alignments they marked are occurring. The technologies they tried to describe are becoming possible. The consciousness they explored is becoming the subject of serious scientific investigation. The doors they built might be opening again. The question is, are we ready to walk through them? There's a chamber beneath the Sphinx, long rumored but not officially excavated. Ground-penetrating radar confirms it exists. The Egyptian authorities acknowledge its presence but haven't authorized entry. Why? What could be down there that makes powerful institutions reluctant to reveal it? Perhaps nothing, perhaps the chamber is empty, and the caution is simply to prevent damage to the structure. Or perhaps there's something that challenges the established narrative so profoundly that its revelation requires careful preparation. In 1993, a German robotics engineer named Rudolf Gantenbrink sent a small robot up a narrow shaft in the Great Pyramid. The shaft, previously thought to be an air vent, led the robot to a sealed door with copper handles. Behind that door, something. Cameras showed a small chamber, but clearer images were never released to the public. The Egyptian government halted further exploration. Official explanations varied: protection of the monument, respect for cultural sensitivity, technical difficulties. But the door remains sealed, and whatever lies beyond it remains a mystery protected by institutional inertia or intentional secrecy. These examples aren't unique. Across the world, there are sites where excavation has been stopped, areas declared off-limits, chambers detected but not opened. Sometimes the reasons are legitimate preservation concerns, political instability, lack of funding. But sometimes the pattern suggests something else, a reluctance to pursue discoveries that might force fundamental reassessment of human history. What would happen if we found clear evidence that ancient civilizations possessed advanced technology, that they could manipulate time or consciousness in ways we're only beginning to theorize, that they were in contact with beings or civilizations from other times? The implications would cascade through every institution. Religious establishments would face challenges to their cosmologies. Educational systems would need complete revision of history curricula. Scientific institutions would have to acknowledge that indigenous knowledge and ancient wisdom contain information that materialist frameworks have dismissed. The social and psychological disruption might be considered dangerous, destabilizing. Perhaps that's why so many ancient sites remain partially explored. Perhaps that's why excavation permits are denied, why funding disappears, why promising research directions get shut down or redirected. Not because of conspiracy in the sinister sense, but because of institutional conservatism, because of the human tendency to protect existing paradigms, because revelation of profound unknowns creates more disruption than comfort. But the information is there. The tombs are waiting. The chambers exist beneath the monuments. The doors, literal and metaphorical, can be opened. The question is whether we'll choose to open them, whether we'll allow ourselves to face what might be revealed, whether we're ready to integrate knowledge that could transform our understanding of who we are and what we might become. You who have wandered this far into the mystery, this deep into speculations that sound like fantasy but rest on fragments of evidence too persistent to ignore, you're the ones who might demand these doors be opened. You're the ones who might insist that knowledge, however challenging, is preferable to ignorance, however comfortable. If this matters to you, let your voice join the others calling for transparency, for investigation, for courageous exploration of our past regardless of what it reveals. Subscribe to ensure you'll hear if these doors do open, if these excavations proceed, if the mysteries begin yielding their secrets. And speak below. What would you do if you could open one sealed chamber, explore one forbidden site? What are you hoping we'll find? What are you afraid we'll find? The tombs weren't built for us to worship from a distance. They were built to be opened, to be used, to transfer knowledge across the chasm of time separating their builders from us. But perhaps they were also built with a timing mechanism, not mechanical but circumstantial. Perhaps they contain information that only becomes comprehensible when humanity reaches a certain level of technological and spiritual development. Open them too soon, and the contents would be misunderstood, misused, or simply incomprehensible. Open them at the right time, and they become catalysts for transformation. Are we at that right time? Our technology is approaching levels where we can seriously discuss time travel, consciousness upload, quantum manipulation of reality. Our spiritual practices are, in some circles, moving beyond dogma toward experiential investigation of consciousness. Our sciences are beginning to acknowledge that materialism is insufficient, that consciousness and observation play fundamental roles in reality, that the universe is stranger and more malleable than mechanistic physics assumed. We're becoming capable of understanding what the tombs might contain. We're developing the language, the mathematics, the technology to decode messages that would have been meaningless to previous generations. We're approaching the moment when the knowledge preserved in stone and myth and carefully encoded symbol might become accessible to us in ways it never has been before. But capability isn't the same as readiness. We can build weapons doesn't mean we should. We can manipulate genes doesn't mean we're wise enough to do so safely. We can potentially access temporal consciousness networks doesn't mean we're prepared for what we might encounter there. The tombs encoded warnings alongside their knowledge. The initiates who built them understood that power without wisdom leads to catastrophe. They tried to build safeguards, to create initiatory systems that would test and prepare those who sought the knowledge, ensuring it would only be fully revealed to those who had developed the necessary wisdom and character. But we're not going through those initiatory systems. We're not spending decades in temples learning discipline and developing consciousness. We're approaching these sites with bulldozers and ground-penetrating radar, trying to access the knowledge through technology rather than through the preparation the builders intended. What happens when we open doors we weren't properly prepared to open? When we access knowledge we don't have the wisdom to use correctly. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps the knowledge is either less powerful than we imagine or more robustly encoded than we can accidentally misuse. Or perhaps we're repeating the pattern, reaching for power without sufficient wisdom, approaching the same threshold where previous civilizations failed. Perhaps the tombs contain knowledge that could save us or destroy us, depending on how we approach it, what we do with it, whether we've learned from the warnings the builders tried so hard to preserve. The constellation patterns carved in ancient temples, showing skies from millennia ago or millennia in the future. What if they're not just records but coordinates? Temporal addresses marking moments when the doors between times are thinnest, when conscious travelers can most easily move between eras. And what if some of those marked moments are approaching in our lifetimes? What if the tombs that have waited silently for thousands of years are about to become active, are about to open not because we excavate them but because the temporal conditions they were designed to respond to are finally occurring? There's a phenomenon reported by multiple independent researchers at ancient sites. The feeling of being watched. Not the paranoid sense of human eyes, but something else. An awareness, a presence, an intelligence that seems to observe without revealing itself. Archaeologists working alone in tombs report it. Tourists visiting sites sometimes mention it. Security guards at museums housing ancient artifacts describe feeling as though the objects are somehow aware of their presence. These reports are dismissed as imagination, as the natural response of human pattern recognition systems generating false positives in ambiguous situations. We're wired to detect agency, to sense when something is paying attention to us, and sometimes that system misfires, creating feelings of being watched when nothing is there. Standard psychology. Standard neuroscience. But what if it's not always false positives? What if consciousness that has been properly prepared and positioned in the right kind of tomb, protected by specific materials and configurations, could maintain some kind of awareness across time? Not embodied consciousness, the body is dead, decayed, gone. But quantum information patterns that persist, that can under certain conditions interact with the consciousness of living humans in proximity. Not ghosts in the supernatural sense. Quantum echoes, information patterns that haven't fully dissipated, that remain weakly entangled with the physical structures of the tombs and can occasionally be detected by the quantum processes underlying human consciousness. Far-fetched? Perhaps. But quantum biology is revealing that biological systems maintain quantum coherence across scales and durations that shouldn't be possible according to earlier theories. If quantum effects can persist in the warm, wet environment of living cells, they might persist in other ways in materials and structures specifically designed to preserve them. The tombs weren't random architectures. They were engineered with extreme precision using materials chosen for specific properties. What if part of that engineering was to create conditions that could preserve quantum information patterns across millennia? If so, then the feeling of being watched in these places might be real, might be the faint interaction between your consciousness and the preserved consciousness patterns of those who used the tombs millennia ago. Their awareness, maintained in attenuated form, sensing when living consciousness enters their preserved space. Perhaps even attempting to communicate, though communication across such radical differences in state would be difficult, would mostly fail, would result in nothing more than vague feelings, intuitions, the sense that something is trying to be conveyed but the channel is too degraded to carry clear meaning. Unless the observer is sensitive, trained, or simply lucky enough to be in the right state of consciousness at the right moment. Then perhaps clearer communication becomes possible. The flashes of understanding that some researchers report. The dreams that come after visiting tombs. Dreams containing information the dreamer couldn't have known. The insights that emerge, feeling like memory rather than discovery. These are anecdotes, not evidence. They're not reproducible, not measurable, not amenable to controlled study. But they're persistent enough, consistent enough across culture and time, that they deserve consideration rather than automatic dismissal. What if the tombs are still occupied, not by bodies but by information patterns? What if the consciousness travelers didn't entirely leave but maintained presence, waiting for the moment when humanity would develop sufficient understanding to consciously participate in the temporal network they established? In the ceiling of Dendra Temple, there's a circular zodiac showing constellations in positions they occupied thousands of years before the temple's construction. But there's an anomaly. One constellation is marked with a symbol that doesn't match any known astronomical body. Researchers have struggled to identify what it represents. Some suggest it's symbolic rather than astronomical. Others think it's a planet or comet. But what if it's something else? A marker, a signal, a representation not of a celestial object but of a temporal coordinate, of a when rather than a where. The ancients didn't separate time and space the way we do. To them, these were different aspects of the same reality. A location wasn't just a spatial coordinate but a space-time coordinate. The tomb built at a specific place was also built for a specific time, or multiple specific times, moments when astronomical and terrestrial conditions aligned to create the circumstances under which the tomb's true function became active. If you mapped all the major ancient sites and overlaid their astronomical alignments, their temporal markers, their encoded dates, what pattern would emerge? Some researchers have tried this. They found that many sites mark common temporal moments, solstices, equinoxes, precession cycles, but some mark moments that haven't occurred yet. Alignments that will happen in our near future. Conjunctions and configurations that we're approaching now. What happens at those moments? Do the tombs activate? Do the doors between times open? Do consciousness travelers find it easier to project or receive? Does information flow more freely across temporal boundaries? The ancients seemed to think something important happened during these astronomical alignments, important enough to encode them in monument after monument, to build entire civilizations around tracking and marking these moments. We're living in one of those marked moments now. Multiple ancient calendars point to our era as significant. The Mayan long count calendar's notable cycle shift in 2012. The precession of the equinoxes transitioning from Pisces to Aquarius. Various astronomical alignments that haven't occurred in thousands of years. Ancient prophecies from multiple cultures pointing to this period as a time of transformation, of return, of revelation. Prophecy is not prediction. It's not magic. But it might be information transfer. If consciousness can access temporal information, if the tombs were built to facilitate this, if the warnings and promises encoded in ancient structures are based on actual knowledge of future events obtained through temporal consciousness projection, then prophecy is just compressed information about probable futures, transmitted backward by those who have seen them. Not deterministic prediction. Quantum mechanics tells us the future exists in superposition, in multiple possibilities until observation collapses them into actuality. But probabilistic guidance. Information about which paths lead to survival and which to catastrophe, offered by those who have navigated these decision trees and know the outcomes. Warnings from travelers who have seen where certain choices lead and are trying to influence the choice points to favor better outcomes. If that's what prophecy is, then the ancient predictions pointing to our era aren't mystical nonsense. They're data, they're guidance. They're the temporal consciousness network that the tombs were built to maintain, finally reaching the moment when the information becomes relevant, when the doors open, when we're positioned at a critical choice point that will determine which future timeline we collapse into. What choice are we facing? At the most fundamental level, it's the same choice every civilization has faced when it reaches technological maturity. Do we use our power wisely, with understanding of consequences and responsibility toward future generations? Or do we prioritize short-term gains, immediate comfort, tribal advantage over collective survival? Do we develop wisdom commensurate with our power? Or do we destroy ourselves with capabilities we're not mature enough to handle? Every ancient text that discusses the fall of previous worlds, the catastrophes that ended previous ages, the destructions that came to advanced civilizations, they all attribute the catastrophe to the same fundamental cause. Not natural disaster, though disasters occurred. Not invasion, though conflicts happened. But hybris, pride, the conviction that technological mastery conferred superiority, that power made wisdom unnecessary. The belief that they could manipulate fundamental forces without consequence, that they could dominate nature rather than harmonize with it, that they were the pinnacle of existence and everything existed for their exploitation. The same choice we're facing now. We have the power to alter climate, to manipulate genes, to create artificial intelligence, to split atoms, to potentially access capabilities that previous generations considered godlike. We can do things that the ancients built entire civilizations trying to achieve. But have we developed the wisdom? Have we learned the lessons they tried to encode in their tombs and temples? Or are we repeating the pattern, racing toward the same cliff they fell from? The tombs suggest that some in ancient civilizations saw the catastrophe coming and tried to preserve knowledge for those who would come after. They tried to warn us. They tried to encode understanding of what went wrong and what would be needed to avoid repeating the disaster. They built their monuments and tombs as messages across time, hoping that we would decode them and learn before we reached the same breaking point they did. Are we listening? When we look at ancient sites and see impossible precision, do we ask how it was achieved and why? When we see astronomical knowledge that shouldn't exist, do we wonder what else they knew? When we find encoded warnings in myth and symbol and stone, do we treat them as superstition or as data from empirical observers who saw things we haven't acknowledged yet? The tombs aren't just about time travel in the science fiction sense of moving physical bodies through temporal dimensions. They're about transferring information, wisdom, consciousness across the barrier of civilizational collapse. They're about ensuring that knowledge survives even when the societies that generated it don't. They're about creating a network that transcends the rise and fall of individual cultures, that maintains continuity even through apocalypse, that gives each new iteration of civilization access to the hard-won understanding of those who came before. We're part of that network now, whether we acknowledge it or not. We're the recipients of the messages the tombs were built to transmit. We're the ones standing at the choice point with access to the warnings and the wisdom, with the capacity to choose differently than our predecessors did. We can close the cycle, learn the lessons, develop the wisdom, survive the transition, and eventually become the travelers ourselves, reaching back to help those who come after us, maintaining the network across time. Or we can ignore the warnings, dismiss the evidence, continue on our current path, and become another cautionary tale encoded in ruins for whoever emerges from whatever catastrophe results from our choices. Another set of tombs, another sealed door, another mystery for future archaeologists to puzzle over while wondering how we could have known so much and understood so little. The choice is ours. The tombs can't make us choose wisely. They can only preserve the information, maintain the network, keep the doors open. But we have to walk through them. We have to engage with the knowledge seriously, not as entertainment or mystical fascination but as data relevant to our survival. We have to ask the hard questions. What were they trying to tell us? What did they know? What can we learn from their successes and failures? And perhaps most importantly, what would they think of us? The consciousness travelers who might still maintain presence in their tombs, observing through mechanisms we barely understand. What do they see when they look at our civilization? Do they see a culture learning from the past, developing wisdom along with technology, preparing to navigate the transition successfully? Or do they see the pattern repeating, the same mistakes being made, the same catastrophe approaching? We can't know for certain. We can't open a direct channel of communication with whatever consciousness might persist in quantum states in these ancient tombs. We can't ask them directly whether we're on the right path. But we can observe. We can study. We can take seriously the possibility that they knew things we need to relearn. We can approach the mysteries with humility rather than assumption, with curiosity rather than certainty. The tombs built for time travelers weren't monuments to defeat death. They were investments in the future. They were attempts to create continuity across the ruptures of history. They were expressions of faith that knowledge matters, that wisdom can be preserved and transmitted, that consciousness transcends the limitations we assume confine it. They were the ancient equivalent of time capsules, but far more sophisticated, not just preserving artifacts but attempting to preserve awareness, to maintain consciousness across time, to create a network of understanding that would survive any catastrophe and be available to any culture that achieved sufficient development to access it. We might be reaching that level of development now. Our physics is approaching their metaphysics. Our technology is beginning to replicate their techniques through different means. Our consciousness research is rediscovering what their practices taught. The gap between their world and ours is narrowing. The messages are becoming comprehensible. The doors are starting to open. What will we do with what we find? That's the question the tombs ask us. That's the test they present. That's the choice point we stand at. The ancient consciousness travelers who built these structures and positioned themselves within them did their part. They preserved the knowledge. They maintained the network. They waited across millennia for the moment when we would be ready to receive what they had to give. That moment might be now. The tombs are waiting. The doors are unsealed or can be opened. The information is there. The wisdom is preserved. The consciousness network spans time, connecting past and future, offering us the chance to learn from those who came before and to contribute to those who will come after. The final question the tombs pose is simple and impossible. Who are you? Not your name, your job, your role in society. But fundamentally, what is the consciousness that perceives these words, that contemplates these mysteries, that considers the possibility of time travelers and temporal networks and information preserved across millennia? What is awareness? Where does it come from? Where does it go? Is it truly generated by your brain, contained within your skull, limited to your lifetime? Or is it something else, something more fundamental, something that your brain accesses but doesn't create? The ancients believed consciousness was eternal, that death was a transition rather than an ending, that awareness continued in some form beyond biological termination. We treat this as religious belief, as hopeful speculation unsupported by evidence. But what if it's not belief but knowledge? What if the practices they developed, the experiences they cultivated in their temples and tombs, gave them direct empirical evidence of consciousness continuing beyond the body? Modern near-death experience research provides intriguing data. People who have been clinically dead, no heartbeat, no brain activity, sometimes report vivid experiences. They describe floating above their bodies, observing the resuscitation efforts, traveling through tunnels of light, encountering deceased relatives, experiencing profound knowledge and peace. Skeptics attribute these to brain hypoxia, to neurochemical processes in the dying brain. Perhaps that's correct. But some near-death experiencers report information they shouldn't have access to, conversations that occurred in other rooms, objects on high shelves they couldn't have seen, events that happened while they were demonstrably unconscious. How? If consciousness is quantum, if it operates at least partially outside the brain, then it might be able to access information non-locally even when the brain is non-functional. Near-death experiences might be moments when consciousness, freed from normal brain constraints, accesses the temporal network the ancient tombs were built to maintain. Brief glimpses of the reality that consciousness travelers learned to navigate, that initiates were trained to experience, that the tombs were designed to facilitate. The ancients didn't fear death the way we do. Not because they were more stoic or had religious faith, but because they knew something we've forgotten. They had methods for exploring death while still alive, for training consciousness to maintain coherence through transitions, for experiencing directly that awareness continues beyond biological cessation. Their tombs weren't built from hope but from knowledge. They knew consciousness could navigate time because they had done it, had trained for generations to do it systematically, had developed technologies and techniques to make it more reliable and controllable. We've lost that knowledge, or most of it. We've replaced experiential wisdom with materialist assumptions. We've decided that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of brain activity, that it begins at birth and ends at death, that it's trapped in individual bodies with no access to information beyond sensory input. These assumptions make certain kinds of science easier, but they might be wrong. Consciousness might be fundamental rather than emergent, non-local rather than contained, eternal rather than temporary. If so, then the tombs were built on understanding we need to rediscover. What would change if you knew, not believed but knew from direct experience, that consciousness continues beyond death? That the awareness reading these words is not a temporary flicker of brain activity but something fundamental, eternal, that will continue regardless of what happens to your body? Would you live differently? Choose differently? Value different things? The ancients who built the tombs lived with that knowledge. It shaped their civilizations. It influenced their choices. It made them invest enormous resources in structures designed for temporal continuity rather than immediate benefit. It made them encode knowledge in stone that would outlast any written text, any oral tradition, any medium less permanent than megalithic architecture. It made them think in terms of thousands of years, of cycles that span generations, of responsibilities to consciousness travelers not yet born and to those long dead who might still maintain presence in the network. We've lost that perspective. We think in election cycles, in quarterly profits, in immediate gratification. We've atomized each individual consciousness convinced of its isolation, its mortality, its fundamental separation from others and from the past and future. Perhaps that's the real catastrophe the ancients tried to warn us about. Not climate disaster or nuclear war or artificial intelligence gone wrong, though those are symptoms, but the loss of understanding of consciousness as eternal, connected, part of a vast temporal network that transcends individual lifetimes and connects all awareness across time. If we remembered that, would we destroy the environment that future generations will inherit? Would we build weapons designed to annihilate not just current enemies but the possibility of future life? Would we create technologies we don't understand, trusting that any catastrophic consequences will happen after we're gone and therefore don't concern us? Or would we act with the responsibility of consciousness travelers who know that we are our descendants, that the future we're creating is one we'll experience, that there is no after we're gone because consciousness continues and will live in the world we're shaping now? The tombs ask us to remember, to reconsider, to investigate, to approach the mystery of consciousness not with materialist assumptions but with open curiosity, to take seriously the possibility that the ancients knew things we've forgotten, that their tombs contain not bodies but information, that their consciousness might persist in forms we can access if we learn how, that we're part of a network spanning time and our choices matter not just for our biological lifetimes but for eternity. This is the message encoded in stone. This is what the astronomical alignments mark. This is why they built so massively, so precisely, so oriented toward future ages. They were building for themselves, for the consciousness travelers they knew they would become, for the eternal awareness that would continue beyond their biological deaths and would need these structures as reference points, as archives, as nodes in the temporal network. And they were building for us. For the consciousness reading these words, whether in our current age or some future time when these ideas might be rediscovered yet again. They built for eternal awareness experiencing itself in temporary biological forms across vast spans of time. They built for you because you are them, are part of the same fundamental consciousness experiencing itself through countless lives and ages. The tombs aren't for the dead. They're for the eternal. And if you've felt something stirring as you've contemplated these mysteries, if something in you resonates with these ideas of consciousness transcending time, of temporal networks spanning ages, of awareness that continues regardless of what happens to individual bodies, that resonance might be memory. The tombs doing what they were designed to do. The network activating. The consciousness travelers reaching across time to touch your awareness and whisper. Remember, you are more than you think. You are eternal. You are connected. You are part of a story that spans not just this lifetime but all time. Remember, in the darkness of the tomb, in the silence of spaces sealed for millennia, something waits. Not bodies, not treasure, not the dead in any conventional sense, but information, patterns, possibility. The crystallized intention of consciousness travelers who understood that time is not a prison but a landscape, that death is not an ending but a doorway, that awareness is fundamental to reality rather than a strange accident of biological complexity. These travelers prepared carefully. They encoded their knowledge in multiple forms, ensuring redundancy across different media and methods. In stone architecture that would survive geological time. In astronomical alignments that would remain accurate across precession cycles. In myth and symbol that would propagate through oral tradition even if writing was lost. In the quantum states of carefully prepared materials positioned in specific configurations within tombs engineered to preserve those states across thousands of years. They cast their message as far forward as physics would allow. And they waited, in whatever form consciousness takes when freed from biological constraint, for the moment when their message would be received, when humanity would develop the understanding necessary to decode what they preserved, when the doors they built would finally open and the knowledge transfer could complete. That moment might be now, not because of any mystical prophecy, but because of the convergence of multiple factors. Our physics is mature enough to consider temporal mechanics seriously. Our consciousness research is beginning to acknowledge non-local and non-classical effects. Our technology is approaching the point where we could potentially build our own tombs, our own consciousness preservation systems, our own methods for navigating time. We're becoming capable of understanding what they did because we're approaching the capability to do it ourselves. When two sides of a communication channel finally achieve comparable capability, communication becomes possible. The ancients built the transmitter. We're finally building the receiver. The message has been propagating across thousands of years, and we're positioned to finally decode it. Not all of it, the full knowledge might take generations to extract and integrate, but enough to confirm the basic thesis. Enough to know they were real, they succeeded, consciousness does transcend biological death, time can be navigated, and we are connected across millennia by something more fundamental than genetic descent or cultural transmission. We are connected by consciousness itself, by the eternal awareness that experiences itself through temporary forms, by the quantum substrate underlying reality in which all times and places exist simultaneously, and information can flow in ways that violate our everyday assumptions about causality and temporal sequence. The tombs were built on this knowledge. The travelers used it, and now perhaps we're ready to access it. What does this mean practically? It means the way forward for humanity might involve looking backward, not abandoning modern science but integrating it with ancient wisdom, not rejecting technology but infusing it with the perspective that comes from understanding consciousness as fundamental and eternal, not choosing between material progress and spiritual development but recognizing these as complementary aspects of a larger evolution of awareness exploring itself through increasingly complex forms. It means taking seriously the possibility that we can learn from the past not just by studying artifacts and texts but by potentially accessing the consciousness of those who lived it. Through meditation, through trained use of altered states, through technologies we might develop based on understanding the quantum nature of consciousness, we might be able to connect with the temporal network the tombs were built to maintain, to receive information directly from consciousness travelers across time, to learn from those who saw civilizations rise and fall, who learned through hard experience what leads to survival and what leads to catastrophe. It means recognizing death not as the enemy to be defeated but as a transition to be understood and navigated. Not with religious faith but with empirical investigation. What happens to consciousness when the body fails? How can we prepare for that transition? What techniques, practices, or technologies might allow consciousness to maintain coherence through death and beyond? These aren't theological questions, they're engineering questions. The ancients approached them that way. So can we. It means considering that the boundaries we assume between self and other, between past and future, between living and dead, might be less absolute than we think. That consciousness might operate at levels where these distinctions blur or disappear. That we might be more connected, more continuous, more unified across time and space than our everyday experience suggests. The tombs were built from that understanding. They're monuments to continuity, to connection, to the fundamental unity of consciousness experiencing itself across vast spans of time and countless forms. If you've stayed with us through this entire exploration, through speculations that challenge every materialist assumption, through possibilities that mainstream science hasn't validated, through ideas that sound like fantasy but rest on fragments of evidence too persistent and too widespread to dismiss entirely, then you're part of what comes next. You're the audience the tomb builders were trying to reach. You're the consciousness that has developed sufficiently to take these ideas seriously, to investigate them, to potentially verify or refute them through disciplined inquiry. This journey doesn't end here. This is an invitation to continue, to approach ancient sites with new eyes, to practice meditation and consciousness exploration with serious intention, to study quantum physics and consciousness research, to preserve your own insights and experiences in forms that might survive your biological death, to contribute to the temporal network, to become yourself a consciousness traveler, to ensure that knowledge continues forward regardless of what catastrophes might come. The tombs have waited for thousands of years. They can wait longer, but they were built with hope, hope that eventually consciousness would evolve to the point where the knowledge they preserve could be accessed and used. Hope that the cycle of rise and catastrophe could be broken. Hope that humanity would learn to balance power with wisdom, technology with understanding, individual awareness with recognition of the eternal, unified consciousness underlying all experience. That hope was invested in you, in the consciousness experiencing these words, in your capacity to consider seriously what has been dismissed, to investigate what has been ignored, to potentially verify what has been preserved. The travelers who built the tombs knew they might never see the result of their work in their biological lifetimes. But they knew, from direct experience of consciousness beyond the body, that they would be present in some form when the doors finally opened, when the knowledge finally transferred, when the network finally activated fully. They're watching now, not with physical eyes but with the eternal awareness that persists beyond biological death. They're waiting to see what you'll do with what they've tried to give you, whether you'll dismiss it and return to comfortable assumptions, or whether you'll investigate, explore, practice, and potentially verify that consciousness is more than brain activity, that time is more than sequence, that you are more than a temporary collection of atoms that will disperse at death. The answer to that choice will determine whether the tombs remain curiosities, ancient monuments that tourists photograph and academics debate, or whether they become active again. Functional nodes in a network of temporal consciousness. Access points where trained awareness can connect with the knowledge preserved across millennia. Gates through which information and perhaps consciousness itself can flow between times. The choice is yours. The tombs can't make you choose exploration over comfort, knowledge over ignorance, connection over isolation. They can only wait, preserved in stone and quantum states, holding the message until someone is ready to receive it. But if you choose to engage, if you decide to take seriously the possibility that the ancients knew something essential that we've forgotten, if you commit to investigating consciousness with the same rigor we apply to external reality, then something remarkable might happen. The message might finally complete its journey across thousands of years. The knowledge might transfer. The network might activate. You might discover that you are, in fact, the consciousness traveler the tombs were built for. That you are the eternal awareness experiencing itself in this particular form, in this particular time, positioned at this particular choice point in human history. And you might discover that you're not alone. That other consciousness travelers are out there, spread across time, working on the same project. Trying to preserve knowledge, to learn wisdom, to ensure continuity, to help awareness evolve toward forms that can balance power with responsibility. You might find yourself part of something far larger than one lifetime, one civilization, one era. You might find yourself part of the eternal project of consciousness knowing itself, healing itself, evolving itself toward higher coherence and greater wisdom. That's what the tombs offer. Not answers exactly, but connection, continuity, context, the knowledge that you're part of an ancient tradition of seekers, travelers, explorers of consciousness and time. That what you learn, what you become, what you contribute will persist. That the work matters not just for this age but for all ages, because consciousness is eternal and what you do ripples across time in ways you can barely imagine. The civilization that built tombs for time travelers didn't die. Transformed. It encoded itself in stone and symbol and quantum states. It dispersed into the network it created. It continues in every consciousness that touches these mysteries and feels the resonance of recognition. Continues in you if you let it. If you remember what you've always known but forgot when you incarnated into this particular biological form. If you awaken to your nature as eternal awareness temporarily experiencing itself as a specific person in a specific time. The tombs are calling across millennia. Not with sound but with information, with pattern, with the quantum entanglement that connects all consciousness across time. They're calling you home. Not to a place but to a recognition. You are the traveler. You are the one who built these tombs in some past life or future.